Summary of Changes in the Land by William Cronon. Changes in the Land is called an ecological history of colonial New England. William Cronon, who wrote the book, says that the scenery of New England changed a lot between the 17th and 18th centuries. By looking at the history of the environment, you can learn more about the past of people. In 1855, Henry David Thoreau looked at the landscape near his home in Concord, Massachusetts, and compared it to what nature historians from the 17th century had written down. He was sad to see how much it had changed. He was shocked by how many animal and plant species were going extinct. Early people who moved to New England were amazed by how fertile and full the land was. Cronon says that ecological history needs its own set of proof, such as the subjective observations of natural historians and other observers, colonial laws, town records, and ecological phenomena like fossil pollen and tree rings. None of these pieces of evidence were full or fair on their own, but when put together, they paint a useful picture. It is also important not to think that settings will always stay the same if people don't change them. In the real world, ecological processes are always changing. Also, Native Americans had been living in what is now the United States for 10,000 years before European settlers came. This meant that the scenery the Europeans found had already been changed by people. Also, the way that a certain group of people change their surroundings can always change over time. When the Europeans came to settle here, they were blown away by what they thought was a land of prophets. In fact, one thing that made the colonizers' view unique was that they thought of the land and its resources as commodities, or things that had economic value. This way of thought made it less important that every part of nature was part of a web of ecological relationships. It is true that New England before the colonists came was a very diverse, fertile, and full place. There were many different kinds of wild animals and lots of woods. But the scenery was not always the same before Europeans came. Over 12,000 years ago, the area was a glacial tundra that slowly changed into the land the Europeans saw. The seasons in New England were not too different from those in Europe, but summer and winter were more different. Some of the first settlers didn't realize this, though, and thought that the spring and summer weather was the same all year long. Because of this mistake, some people went hungry and died in the winter. Native people's whole lives were based on the changing of the seasons. This was shown in part by the fact that they were mobile and moved their towns from place to place as the seasons changed. At different times of the year, they also did different things. In the north, native people fished in the spring and summer, collected nuts, berries, and wild plants in the summer, and killed beaver, caribou, and bear in the winter. People in southern New England farmed, but they still moved their fields pretty often to keep the soil from running out. They would grow kidney beans, peas, and corn together on the same field. Women took care of the crops and did other jobs that could be done while taking care of children. Native peoples used controlled forest fires to get rid of undergrowth and improve the health and fertility of the forest as a whole. Overall, the mosaic effect of variety was kept by the way they farmed. Colonizers didn't like how women and men did different jobs in indigenous communities. Since women took care of the fields, colonizers said that women did all the work, which wasn't true. Meanwhile, the native people couldn't figure out why European women didn't seem to do anything. Colonizers said they had the right to take land from native people because they didn't seem to be using it to grow crops. The two groups had different ideas about who owned what, and in the end, the colonizers only acknowledged the power of their own system. For Native Americans, a village owned the land it lived on because it had the right to use it, and other villages and tribes recognized this right. The land was never sold. Instead, it was swapped in ways that were more diplomatic than economic. Personal goods were also limited to things that people had made or used, and people usually shared things instead of keeping them just for themselves. In the same way, animals only became owned when they were killed. Native people thought that they owned the things that came from the land, but these rights were not set in stone and changed with the seasons. There was never a time when a person or group had lasting, exclusive rights to a piece of land. The colonizers thought that the natives' way of handling property rights was not real. Europeans thought that owning something meant having private, exclusive access to it for life. As the English ruler made more and more decisions about land ownership, colonists began to act as if native people only had rights to land if the crown gave them those rights. Over time, it became more common to split land based on abstract geographic boundaries rather than how well it would work for a certain type of farming. Colonizers thought native people were lazy and poor because they didn't farm the land to make the most money, and they used this to take land from native groups. Native people were very ready to trade with colonists, especially in the early days of colonization. They mostly traded animal fur and skins for fabric, weapons, tools, and decorative items. During these contacts, Europeans spread microorganisms that cause many diseases that native people did not have a defense against. This was terrible for the native people. In many towns, up to 90% of the people who lived there died. This large number of deaths caused chaos in the social and political lives of the native people and left the remaining towns very vulnerable. For a while, colonists urged native people to use wampum as a form of currency in trade. However, as time went on, wampum lost its value, and many native people became poor. Also, they had grown to depend on the markets that were now shutting them out. Now that they were poor and couldn't keep living the way they used to, many groups had to sell their land to stay alive. Animals like the beaver almost went extinct because people killed too many of them. Colonization also led to a lot of trees being cut down. Colonists cut down trees as if they were an endless supply, and they did a lot of useless things to get to the best wood. Even worse for the forest than cutting down trees was the growth of farming, which caused huge amounts of forest to be burned down quickly. Destruction of the woods had many strong side effects that completely changed the ecosystem and climate of New England. Even though there were some links between how Native Americans and Europeans farmed, they had very different ideas about how to treat animals. Native people killed wild animals, but Europeans kept grazing animals that they kept at home. Animals eating other people's crops was a major source of strife in colonial New England, especially when it came to pigs. Fences were put up all over because animals were so annoying. Over time, different kinds of animals started to be kept in their own cages. Fences also made it clear to the eye that different parts of private land were separate. Grazing animals did a lot of damage to the environment and were one of the main reasons why soil exhaustion got worse. When the soil was getting dry, the colonists used fish or ash from burned trees to keep it wet, which was both wasteful and not enough to keep the soil fertile. Europeans also brought over weeds and bugs that did a lot of damage to the ecosystems in New England. The 19th century and the Industrial Revolution were the most important times for change in New England. But it's important not to let this faster change overshadow the fact that the country also changed a lot during the colonial era. By the time the year 1800 came around, New England had become a world of fields and fences. At that time, the number of native people was only a small part of what it used to be, while there was a huge influx of newcomers. It's easy to say that everything that changed in the environment during the colonial period was caused by the capitalist economic system that European settlers brought with them. In fact, this was by far the most important thing that caused change during this time. Native people pushed back against colonization, tried to keep their old ways of life, and tried to change so they could have a chance to live. In the end, they couldn't stop the huge and often very bad changes that colonization made to the landscape.
About the author. William Cronon is an environmental historian. He got his BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, his MA, MPhil, and PhD from Yale, and his DPhil, second PhD, from Oxford. Changes to the Land started out as a paper he wrote for a class at Yale when he was a graduate student there. It was Cronon's first book, and it came out in 1983. His first job in academia was as a history professor at Yale, where he got tenure. Nature's Metropolis, Chicago and the Great West was his second book, which came out in 1991. The next year, he co-edited a book called Under an Open Sky, Rethinking America's Western Past. After 10 years, he left Yale and became a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is still working. In 1995, he wrote a second book called Uncommon Ground: Rethinking the Place of Humans in Nature. He has won the Guggenheim Fellowship and the MacArthur Fellowship, among other honors and awards.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.